Is all boost the same? Like, say, from a Whipple versus the electric turbo? Well, no. Let me show you. After our drag test, I managed to get fairly sick somehow, and I'm still feeling a little bit rough. You could probably hear it in my voice, but I didn't want to wait any longer to put out another video, and you guys probably didn't want me to wait any longer either. So here we are. By the way, before we get started, happy Father's Day to all you dads out there. This is a good one for me. My daughter started her new job and brought me back some food from the restaurant she's working at today. So that was fantastic and a step in the right direction, and I hope all you dads out there have a equally great Father's Day. Now, the electric turbo isn't the first forced induction solution that I've had on the LTD. It's like the fourth or fifth one, actually. I built all kinds of blower kits before. The last one, and the most powerful one, was based around a 2.3 liter Whipple. I built a custom intercooler core for it. Once I upped the boost on it, it started chucking belts, did some body damage. It built a really cool tensioner out of a Hayabusa steering damper with 50 weight oil in it, an adjustable spring tensioner and ball bearings, and that one held up. Check out what it was like on the dyno. Man, that thing screams on the dyno, doesn't it? It sounded awesome. It was a cool setup. It worked really well. It took a ton of ice through the air-to-water intercooler. It melt like 10 to 15 pounds of ice in a single quarter-mile pass. But what kind of power did it actually make, and how does that compare to the electric turbo? By the way, I'm proudly wearing my MGM Controllers t-shirt. This is the ESC that did not blow up, held together along with the LMT motor on the electric turbo, so I feel great wearing this shirt. I'm not sponsored by them. I did pay full price for it. But, you know, hey, it's a victory, right? And who doesn't want to celebrate a victory? This is the horsepower graph from that wicked sounding dyno pull. And ironically, it's a week short of exactly 6 years before we did the electric turbo pull. Now, they're both on a dyno jet. They are different dyno jets, so it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, but at least it gets us a bit in the ballpark. If you look at the horsepower curve here, it's pretty thick. This is meaty. This is also with the power glide. The engine, the transmission, they're all essentially the same. Nothing's really changed. Obviously, throttle bodies are different because the Whipple has a gigantuous freaking oval throttle body on the front of it. And of course, we now have the 100 millimeter on the electric turbo setup. So those don't really make much difference. This was intercooled, and this was pulling a fair amount of boost, but it also gave us one heck of a power curve. It was pretty slick. So if we look, say here, you know, 544.09 right here, the x-axis here is time. And that's simply because the dyno I was on couldn't get a good RPM signal, so we have to compare against time. And that's also why there's going to be no torque figures, besides which it's a glide. You don't really get good torque information from a glide on a dyno anyway. It's kind of throwaway stuff. But horsepower is what gets you down the track, so that's what we're interested in. So that's a big, fat, meaty power curve. Now, it wasn't that long ago, you know, about a month ago, since we were on the dyno with the electric turbo. Let's take a look at one of those pulls in case you haven't seen it. Now, admittedly, that sounded much more mild. But let's go ahead and overlay that graph versus this one. You can tell they're kind of different, but they're kind of not. So the electric turbo held on a little bit better. It held on a little higher RPM. It was pushing through the converter a little bit higher. And, you know, anything below here, we simply could have matched the Whipple by engaging the electric turbo sooner, which, you know, we could have done, but we didn't want to blow through the converter any harder than we already were. But these power levels are pretty comparable, I think, all around. I mean, obviously the Whipple's up a little bit in the meat of the curve, but the electric turbo hung on a little bit better up high. The question then becomes, how much boost did it take to get these numbers? And let's take a look at the data logs from both. So the first data log we're going to look at is going to be from the Whipple, and that one is right here. So the boost kind of had this tendency to pulsate a little bit, and I actually ended up putting a fuel filter in the map sensor line just to give a sort of a little volume for it to stabilize in after the fact, but it really didn't have an impact on horsepower numbers, just kind of makes the trace smoother. And by the way, the trace I'm looking at here is this red trace right here is boost. And you can tell even where it's at right now, it's 12.7 psi. So if we select the bulk of the run, and look at the averages, we hit, average 5,645 RPM. Our max RPM was 6,400. Our average boost was 13.8 PSI, and we made a peak of 17.2, but, I think that's kind of in the anomaly region. Once it's smoothed out, it's closer to 15. And what's interesting, really, is the duty cycle. The duty cycle averaged about 75% on 80-pound injectors. That's a lot of fuel for this power level. I'm not going to lie. You can also see where the air intake temperature, even though we had ice in the air-to-water intercooler, was averaging 122 degrees Fahrenheit. So, it's a little bit warm, but basically it took a lot of boost. Let's call it an average of almost 14 PSI to get this. So how did the electric turbo compare? Here's the electric turbos graph for the same pull. So if we average that pull, let's just look at from when we had the electric turbo spooled up, which is, of course, a much shorter pull. Its boost PSI only averaged 6.3. So it's a lot less boost. It's less than half the boost. And the duty cycle was also only 58.5%. Once again, if you compare that to 75%, versus 58%, I mean, that's a huge difference in fuel consumption to make what amounts to almost exactly the same power. Now, there's another thing. You've heard me complain before about people using different correction factors to make their dyno numbers look a little bit better. Particularly, that seems to be a thing on YouTube. There is some other places where you can actually look to see if people are fudging their numbers. And I've checked out both of these because, I've been going to Ray now for a while. He's been a good friend for a while. But before this was, pulled by a guy at a local shop here. He was nice enough, but I looked at the run conditions. Let's take a look at the run conditions on the Whipple. So the run conditions on the Whipple show an absolute pressure of 29.8 inches of mercury, vapor pressure of 0.2, air temp of 81.7, humidity of 20%, but whoa, what's this? An altitude of 4,500 feet. That, as it turns out, is the default setting on a dyno jet. That guy apparently never adjusted for that. How that would have an impact on the actual numbers we're seeing, I'm not sure, but I would guess they would be less. Let's take a look and see how Ray has his set up. So if we look at the same run info, but for the electric turbo, it's very comparable. Humidity was a little bit drier, air temperature was about the same, vapor pressure was a little bit better, but the altitude is 700 feet, which is probably much more accurate to where that dyno actually is. So I would say that these horsepower numbers are pretty much a wash in the real world. And in fact, in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and compare our first track runs. I'm a creature of habit, as it turns out, and a couple of weeks after this dyno session, I took the car to the track too. So that's going to be in the next video. That one's coming up right quick, I promise. But going back to the data logs here, once again, there is no comparison. The electric turbo is so much more efficient, plus it's much more controllable, plus it's lighter. It has all these advantages. The Whipple, on the other hand, it sounds cool, but it's heavy, it's difficult to install, it affects access to spark plugs on the passenger side, it requires tons of ice to go with you to the track. It's just nowhere near as slick as the electric turbo is. And once again, it's also less than half as efficient. Uses more fuel, the tuning window is smaller, it takes more than twice as much boost to make approximately the same power. So now the question is, how did these two perform comparatively at the track? Now, we do know how the electric turbo did, and if you've been watching my videos, you know too, but you probably don't know how the Whipple did at this power level. In the comments below, go ahead and put your guesses. How do you think the Whipple did at this power level? And then we're going to compare that to how the electric turbo did at this power level. And there's a lot more that we can do with the electric turbo, and that's all in the works, including fixing the broken torque converter, replacing that thing. I'm also going to do some transmission temperature tests, because that was an issue on the dyno when we drove all the way up to Ray's. This dyno jet that I did the Whipple on was pretty nearby. It was like 10 miles away instead of 100 miles away, so the transmission was nowhere near as hot, although the weather conditions were pretty similar. So yeah, there's a lot more fun stuff coming up, so don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, all that happy jazz, and thank you guys so much for watching. I wouldn't be doing all this if it wasn't for all your support, and I do sincerely appreciate that. And yeah, we're going to have a lot more fun, so stay tuned. I'll catch you all in the next one.